She walked into the jiu-jitsu gym with a nervous but determined smile. It was her very first time stepping inside that room, and she could already feel the weight of many eyes turning toward her. The sound of feet sliding across mats, the sharp claps of hands practicing grips, and the low hum of chatter filled the air. She tried to focus on the reason she came, to learn, to grow stronger, and to test herself. But the stares told her she was different here. Some were curious, some skeptical, and a few even looked amused, as if silently asking, "What is she doing here?" Her heart beat fast, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had seen fighters on television, men and women alike, grappling with incredible skill. Something about the discipline of jiu-jitsu drew her in. She loved the idea that it wasn't about size or brute strength alone, was about technique, timing, and heart. That thought gave her courage. She told herself she belonged here, even if nobody else believed it yet, as she walked further inside. She noticed how the students already seemed bonded, laughing with one another, moving with confidence. They wore their uniforms proudly, some with colored belts wrapped tightly around their waists, proof of their experience. Her own beginner's belt looked plain, almost fragile, tied in a knot that didn't feel quite right. She adjusted it nervously, hoping no one noticed her inexperience, but they did. A few glanced at her belt, then back at her face, as if confirming their assumptions. She tried to ignore the looks and focused on the room itself. The mats smelled faintly of sweat and disinfectant, the kind of scent that spoke of countless battles fought and lessons learned. Posters of jiu-jitsu champions hung on the walls, their strong poses seeming to challenge her silently. "Do you have what it takes?" She whispered inside her mind, "Yes, I do." When the instructor entered, the students quickly lined up. She joined at the end of the row, trying to blend in. The instructor scanned the group, pausing for a moment on her. His expression was neutral. But she couldn't help feeling judged, as though he, too, wondered if she could survive here. The warm-up began, and she pushed herself to keep pace jumping, stretching, rolling on the mat. Sweat formed on her forehead, but she refused to slow down. She knew that every move was being noticed, and she wanted to prove, even in small ways, that she belonged. Still, the whispers began. She heard a faint laugh behind her when she stumbled on a drill. A student muttered something she couldn't quite catch, but the mocking tone was clear. She felt her cheeks burn, but she pressed forward, repeating the move again and again until she got it right. She didn't respond, didn't defend herself. Instead, she let her silence become her shield. Every step of that first encounter felt like a test not of strength, but of spirit. It would have been easy to walk out, to tell herself this wasn't her place, but something inside her refused to leave. She had carried too many dreams, endured too many struggles, to give up now because of a few stares and sneers. She remembered all the times she had been underestimated before, told she wasn't good enough, strong enough, or capable enough. Each of those memories lit a fire inside her chest. She pushed through the warm-up, determined not to show weakness. When the students partnered for basic drills, she found herself paired with someone who looked less than thrilled. His eyes rolled almost invisibly, but she caught it. Still, she smiled and introduced herself politely, gripping his hand firmly as they began. At first, his resistance was obvious, as though he didn't want to waste his time with her. She studied every instruction carefully, absorbing details like a sponge. Her body was clumsy at first, but her mind was sharp. Step by step, she started to mimic the moves with surprising accuracy. The more she practiced, the more she realized jiu-jitsu wasn't about appearances. It was about leverage, angles, and patience. For a moment, she even forgot the whispers and the stares. She focused only on the technique, the twist of her hips, the placement of her hands, the way momentum could overpower muscle. A spark of excitement ran through her veins. She wasn't perfect, but she could feel herself learning by the end of the session. She was drenched in sweat, her muscles aching. The laughter and ridicule hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted inside her. She had faced the discomfort of walking into a place where she was not welcomed, where doubt hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and she hadn't broken. Instead, she had stood her ground, breathed through the pressure, and learned. That first encounter wasn't glorious. It wasn't a victory anyone would write headlines about. But it was the seed of something greater. The mockery she endured was just fuel, and the determination she carried in her heart became her silent answer to every doubtful glance. She didn't need to speak. She would let her actions tell her story in time. And deep down, though no one else in that room believed it yet, she knew one day they would remember this first encounter not because she was ridiculed, but because it was the day they underestimated the wrong person. Asterisk, she had made it through the warm-ups. Her lungs burning, her arms aching, but she kept moving. She told herself that pain was temporary, but quitting would last forever. As she bent down to tie her shoelace, she heard the first clear laugh. It was sharp and quick, the kind of laugh that people let out when they don't expect you to notice. She raised her head slightly, pretending she didn't hear. But she did. Every sound seemed louder when it was aimed at her. Two students whispered to each other near the corner of the mat. Their eyes flicked toward her, then back again, their lips curling into half-hidden smirks. She didn't need to hear the words to know the meaning. She had seen this before in school, at work, even. Walking into certain rooms where she wasn't expected. That look, that little smirk, said everything. You don't belong here. The instructor called for partner drills, and she felt the tension rise in her stomach. Nobody rushed toward her. Partners quickly paired off with friends or regular training. Mates? She was left standing there, alone, for a few awkward seconds that felt like hours. Finally, one student sighed and stepped forward, as if volunteering for a chore. His body language screamed impatience. When they shook hands, his grip was limp, dismissive. They began practicing a basic guard pass. She tried to remember every detail the instructor had just demonstrated. One hand on the collar, one hand on the knee, steady pressure, smooth movement. But her partner didn't make it easy. He gave her half-hearted resistance, then exaggerated. Every mistake she made, when she placed her knee too far to the side, he muttered under his breath, too slow. When her grip slipped, he chuckled quietly, shaking his head. It wasn't the words themselves that cut it was the tone. Soon, others began to notice. A few glanced over, watching her fumble through the drill. One voice from the sidelines said, "She's lost already." Another added, 14 seconds. Tops, they laughed. She didn't know what they meant by 14 seconds, but the mocking predictions stuck in her ears like a thorn. Every laugh echoed louder than the instructor's voice. Every smirk burned hotter than the sweat dripping down her face. She wanted to shout, to tell them she was new, to ask for patience, to remind them that everyone had a first day once. But her pride kept her silent. She swallowed the hurt and forced her body to keep moving. As the drills ended, sparring rounds began. This was the moment she had both feared and longed for. Rolling on the mat was where reputations were built. It was where strength and skill revealed themselves. And it was also where ridicule could turn merciless. When her name was called, she stepped forward, trying to hide the tremble in her hands. Across from her, another student grinned mockingly. He whispered something to the man next to him before. Stepping onto the mat, they both laughed. She tightened her belt. The knot shook slightly in her fingers, but she pulled it firm. They bowed and began. Almost instantly, he rushed her with force, trying to overwhelm her. She stumbled, and the spectators chuckled. Every slip of her foot, every late reaction earned another laugh. She felt like a clown in a cruel circus. where the crowd came not to cheer, but to sneer. The worst part wasn't the physical struggle, it was the mental one. Her body screamed with effort, but her mind screamed with doubt. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I should have never walked in. Yet, beneath that doubt, a smaller voice whispered something else. Stay. Prove them wrong. One mistake doesn't define you. One laugh doesn't break you. She tightened her grip on her opponent's sleeve and adjusted her posture. She could feel him trying to rush her again, but this time she braced better. It wasn't perfect far from it, but she slowed him down. The instructor nodded faintly, as if to say, yes, that's the way. But the room didn't notice the small victory. Instead, someone clapped mockingly from the sidelines, saying, "Don't break a nail." Laughter followed. It cut deep, deeper than any choke or arm lock ever could. When the round ended, she sat back on her knees, gasping for breath. Sweat dripped from her chin, her GI sticking uncomfortably to her body. She wiped her face with her sleeve, pretending it was only the sweat that stung her eyes. But she knew it wasn't just sweat. In that moment, she faced a choice. She could walk out, leave the ridicule behind, and never come back. Or she could stay, swallow the humiliation, and let it carve her into something stronger. Her chest heaved. Her muscles screamed, but her spirit whispered, "Not today. Not like this." She lowered her head, closed her eyes for a moment, and made a promise to herself. She would take every laugh, every whisper, every sneer, turn it into fuel. The ridicule was cruel, yes, but it also gave her a gift. It gave her fire. And that fire would soon burn brighter than anyone in that room could imagine. Asterisk after the sting of laughter and whispers. She sat quietly at the edge of the mat, tying her belt again with slow, steady hands. Her body was sore, her chest still, heaving from the last sparring round, and her mind replayed every mocking word she had heard that day. Yet she didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't let her anger spill out. Instead, she chose silence. But it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone gathering strength. She realized that nothing she said would change their minds. Words couldn't erase the smirks or undo the judgment in their eyes. If she spoke up, they would only laugh louder. If she complained, they would point and say she was weak. So she decided that her answer would come in a different language thing. Language of patience, discipline, and relentless practice. From that day on, she walked into the gym with a new rhythm. She no longer looked around to see who was laughing or whispering. She kept her eyes on the mat. She bowed to it with respect every time, as if telling herself, "This is where I will build myself. This is where I will rise." During warm-ups, when her muscles ached and others slacked off, she pushed harder. Every jump, every roll, every stretch, she did it with full effort, even when no one was watching. When drills were assigned, she repeated them again and again, far beyond what was required. While others chatted between rounds, she practiced. Her grips tested her balance and studied her breathing. Her silence became a kind of shield. The same people who had mocked her tried at times to provoke her with little jokes, but she gave no reaction. She never snapped back. She never defended herself with excuses. She simply nodded, tightened her belt, and kept training. Slowly, the ridicule lost its power. They still laughed sometimes, but without her reaction, the laughter felt weaker, less satisfying for them. Outside the gym, she carried her training into every part of her life. She studied videos of matches late into the night, her eyes glued to the screen as champions explained techniques. She read about the philosophy of Jiu-Jitsu, the way it was about using leverage, not strength, patience, not force. She fell asleep, dreaming of arm locks and guard passes, and she woke up eager to try them. Each failure became her teacher. When she was swept onto her back, she studied how it happened. When she was trapped in a choke, she noted where she had left an opening. Instead of sulking, she smiled quietly to herself, thinking, "Next time, I'll do better." And each time she returned, she did. The others began to notice, even if they didn't say it out loud. At first, they had expected her to quit within days. Then, after weeks, they assumed she would fade away when it got too tough, but she never left. Day after day, she showed up. No matter how sore, how tired, or how bruised. She returned to the mat with the same silent focus. She started moving differently. Her steps became lighter, her balance firmer. Her hands no longer trembled when she gripped a sleeve or collar. Her breathing slowed under pressure, no longer frantic but calm. The quiet student who had once looked clumsy was now flowing with a rhythm that even the advanced fighters couldn't ignore. Still, she didn't speak much. She let her progress speak for her. There was power in her silence, a power that unnerved. Some of those who had laughed before, they realized she wasn't here for attention or praise. She wasn't here to prove them wrong with words. She was here to prove herself right with action. One evening, after a particularly hard sparring session, the instructor pulled her aside. His eyes, usually stern, softened just slightly. He said only a few words, but they meant everything. "You're improving fast. Keep going." She nodded, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles. That single sentence was worth more than all the mockery she had endured. It was a sign that her silence was working. Weeks turned into months, and her body transformed. Muscles tightened, reflexes sharpened, and her mind grew calmer under stress. Where once she had stumbled, she now stood firm. Where once she had panicked under pressure, she now waited, breathing, calculating. She learned to love the grind, to embrace the soreness, to welcome the challenge. The silence was no longer just her shield, it had become her weapon. Every quiet hour of practice was sharpening her edge. Every ignored insult was fuel for her fire. Every bruise on her body was proof that she was becoming something stronger than ridicule could ever touch. And deep down, she carried a quiet vision. She saw herself, one day, standing on that mat, not as the one mocked, but as the one remembered. She didn't know when it would happen or how, but she believed it would. That belief kept her steady, even when others still doubted. Her silence was not emptiness, was the sound of determination building. It was the calm before a storm that nobody else could see coming. Soon, these same people who had laughed at her would witness something they never expected. And when it happened, she wouldn't need to shout or remind them of their words. The mat itself would carry her answer. Asterisk, the months of silence had built her strength. Every bruise had toughened her spirit. Every repetition had carved patience into her bones. She had learned to carry herself differently, no longer the clumsy newcomer who fumbled through drills, but someone who moved with intent. Yet, despite her progress, many in the gym still doubted her. They had stopped laughing openly, but their eyes still carried that quiet disbelief. She will never match us. She will never last. One evening, after warm-ups, the instructor clapped his hands. The sound cut across the room, drawing everyone's attention. He announced sparring rounds, pairing students carefully, as always. The matches were usually balanced beginners with other beginners, intermediates with those closer to their level. She expected the same. She assumed she would be paired with someone who could challenge her, but not overwhelm her. But then his eyes landed on her. He paused, then turned toward the far end of the mat, where a man sat cross-legged, adjusting his belt. That was black. It carried not only color, but weight, a symbol of mastery that few ever reached. The man himself was calm, almost bored, as though sparring with the students was routine for him. He was a master, respected and admired. Some even feared him. The instructor's voice rang out, "You too. Step onto the mat." The room seemed to freeze. Students exchanged quick glances. Few eyebrows shot up. Someone whispered, "No way." Other muttered, "This is going to be brutal." She felt her stomach twist. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. A master? With me? She wasn't ready. She knew it. Everyone knew it. This was supposed to be her safe place to learn, not a stage for humiliation. But when she looked up, the instructor's expression told her it wasn't a mistake. She bowed her head slowly, tying her belt tighter. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face stayed calm. Inside, a storm raged. She could hear the whispers behind her, the laughter that was already brewing, ready to erupt when she failed. But she remembered her promise. She had vowed never to run, never to quit, no matter how heavy the challenge. The master rose smoothly to his feet. His movements were precise, unhurried. He walked to the center of the mat with the air of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His eyes met hers briefly, and though his expression remained neutral, there was a flicker of amusement, like a teacher preparing to scold a child. They bowed to each other. She lowered her head deeply, more out of respect than fear. When she straightened, she let out a quiet breath. Steadying herself, the students leaned in, forming a circle around the mat. The atmosphere thickened, buzzing with anticipation. For them, this wasn't a fair match, it was entertainment. They expected a quick and painful lesson, a reminder that beginners should know their place. The instructor signaled for them to begin. The master stepped forward lightly, stance relaxed. He didn't rush, he didn't need to. His presence alone carried confidence. She mirrored him, her knees bent, her hands ready, her eyes sharp. Inside, her mind repeated the lessons she had drilled endlessly. Breathe, don't panic, stay calm. The master smirked faintly and made the first move, reaching for her collar. His grip was strong, commanding. She felt the weight of his control instantly, pressing her backward. The onlookers chuckled, convinced it was already over. She dug her heels into the mat, resisting just enough to stay upright. Her silence spoke again. She did not gasp. She did not flinch. She simply adjusted, shifting her weight the way she had practiced hundreds of times. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to fight wildly, to push back with desperation. But she didn't. She remembered. Technique, not strength. Patience, not panic. The master tried to sweep her, and for a split second, she faltered. The crowd leaned forward, ready for the inevitable fall. But instead of crumbling, she bent her body in the opposite direction, slipping out of his angle. His sweep missed by inches. The laughter quieted for a moment. A few eyebrows raised. She had survived the first attack. The master's eyes narrowed. Slightly, he adjusted, moving faster now, testing her reactions. She followed every movement, fueled not by fear, but by the months of silent determination she had poured into training. She remembered the hours of drilling guard positions, the countless times she had failed and learned. Each lesson became a shield now, each mistake a stone in the wall she had built around her spirit. Inside her chest, her heart pounded like a drum. She could feel the weight of the challenge pressing against her, threatening to crush her. But instead of breaking, she leaned into it. She told herself, "This is the test I've been waiting for. This is why I stayed. This is why I endured the ridicule." Seconds passed, though they felt like hours. Every grip, every shift, every breath was a battle, and still she did not quit. Around her, the whispers began to change. Some students still smirked, waiting for her downfall. But others started watching more closely. Their expressions softened from amusement to curiosity. She wasn't winning, but she wasn't folding either. She was holding her ground against someone far beyond her level, and deep down, a thought sparked in her mind, an idea both terrifying and thrilling. What if I can do more than survive? What if I can shock them all? She tightened her grip, her body lowering, her focus narrowing to a single point. The room faded away, the laughter, the whispers, even the fear. All that remained was her and the master. This was no longer just a spar. It was the challenge that would define her. And though nobody else believed it yet, she felt the shift inside her. This wasn't the end of her humiliation. It was the beginning. Of her answer, asterisk, the room was silent, except for the sound of bare feet shifting on the mat. She and the master stood across from one another, both crouched low, hands extended, eyes locked. The students surrounding them leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. No one expected a contest, they expected a quick collapse. But she knew that even the smallest moments could decide everything. Her palms were damp with sweat, but her grip was steady. She reminded herself to breathe deeply, to let the air move in and out like a rhythm. If she lost control of her breathing, panic would follow, and panic was the master's greatest ally. She had learned that lesson the hard way in her early weeks, when she gasped and flailed and failed. Not today. Today, her silence was her weapon. The master's expression hadn't changed. He was calm, almost amused. His body moved with effortless confidence, like a man playing a game he had already won. To him, she was just another beginner, another story to laugh about later. His eyes studied her every movement, waiting for the moment she made her first mistake, and she almost did, as he stepped forward with a lightning-fast grip on her collar. Her first instinct was to pull back in fear. Her body wanted to retreat. But she forced herself to lean in instead, meeting his strength with balance rather than panic. His hand closed around her collar, firm and heavy. But she dug her toes into the mat and shifted her hips just enough to stay upright. The crowd murmured softly. They had expected her to stumble immediately, but she hadn't. The master adjusted his stance, sliding his other hand toward her sleeve. She reacted quickly, pulling her arm in tight to her body. His fingers brushed her sleeve, but failed to hold. It wasn't a big victory, but it was enough to keep her alive. And in this match, survival itself was a kind of triumph. He tried again, moving faster this time, testing her reflexes. His movements were sharp, controlled, polished from years of practice. Hers were rougher, less fluid, but they carried something he hadn't expected: stubbornness. She refused to be moved easily. They circled slowly on the mat, their feet tracing small arcs as they searched for openings. She could hear the faint squeak of skin against mat with every shift, the echo of her heartbeat in her ears. The master lunged forward again, his grip snaking around her sleeve. This time, he succeeded, tugging hard to off-balance her. For a second, her knee buckled. The crowd inhaled sharply, ready for her to fall, but she twisted her hips, dropped her weight, and steadied herself. Her body bent awkwardly, but she refused to collapse. It was messy, yes, but it was survival. The master's eyes narrowed. Was subtle, but she caught it. He was no longer entirely amused. Now, he was paying attention, and that tiny shift fueled her. She realized that in this moment, she had already won something. She had forced him to take her seriously, even if only a little. That thought gave her the courage to push forward. She took a risk. Instead of staying defensive, she stepped in closer, her hand darting toward his lapel. It wasn't perfect. Her grip slipped slightly, but it startled him enough to make him adjust. The crowd let out a surprised murmur. Her heart raced. She had touched him, challenged him, even if just for a heartbeat. The moment felt electric. The master responded instantly, tightening his own grip and pulling her downward. She stumbled onto her knees, and for a second, she thought it was over. His arm wrapped around her shoulder, pressing her into the mat. Pressure built on her chest, heavy and suffocating. The spectators smirked again, whispering, There it is. She's done. But she remembered her training. Don't fight the weight. Use it. Instead of thrashing wildly, she shifted her hips, creating just enough space to breathe. She wriggled her arm free and planted her hand against his hip. With a quick push, she created room to turn her body sideways. It wasn't graceful, but it loosened his control. The crowd fell silent again. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was adapting. Every second she lasted, every grip she broke, every breath she stole back from his control gave her strength. The master tried to press harder, but she resisted with calm. Persistence. Her movements weren't flashy, but they were stubborn, like roots clinging to the earth in a storm. He would not shake her easily. Her silence grew louder in that room than all the whispers. She didn't shout. She didn't grunt. She didn't complain. She only breathed, moved, and endured. And the crowd noticed. Their laughter was fading, replaced by the weight of disbelief. The opening moments stretched on longer than anyone expected. What was supposed to be a quick humiliation was turning into a real test. And she wasn't breaking. Inside her mind, she repeated the mantra she had carried for months. Patience, technique, timing, and then something happened. For the briefest instant, the master overextended. He pulled too hard on her sleeve, leaning his weight slightly forward. It was barely a mistake, one that most wouldn't notice, but she felt it. Her instincts screamed. Now, her hand shot upward, gripping his collar tighter than she ever had before. Her hips shifted, her legs twisted into position. It wasn't perfect her. Muscles trembled, her breath hitched, but the opening was there. And in that flicker of a moment, everything changed. The mat was alive with tension. The circle of students leaned closer, their whispers rising and falling like the hum of bees. The master had her sleeve locked, pressing his weight into her. She was gasping for air, every breath shallow, every muscle trembling under the pressure. By all logic, the match should have ended already. Everyone knew it. A black belt against a beginner wasn't supposed to be a fight. It was supposed to be a lesson. But something inside her refused to collapse. And then it happened. So fast that most didn't notice until it was too late. The master tugged on. Her sleeve with a little too much force, leaning forward, his balance shifting just slightly. It wasn't obvious, just a sliver of space. But she felt it. She had spent months learning to see these tiny cracks, these small mistakes that came only for an instant. To others, it looked like nothing. To her, it was an open door to her mind, snapped into clarity. The noise of the room vanished. The only sound she heard was the rhythm of her own breathing and the pounding of her heart. Her body moved almost on its own, guided by muscle memory she had forged in long, lonely hours of drilling. Her hand shot upward, gripping his collar. Not lazily, not desperately, but tight, fingers digging in with conviction. At the same time, her hips swung to the side, her legs snapping into position. The motion was sudden, fluid, sharp. The master's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. He had expected her to flail, to waste energy, to panic. He had not expected precision. She locked her legs around his arm and shoulder, securing his posture. The triangle choke the move she had practiced. Over and over in silence was forming. Her thighs pressed against his neck, her grip tightened on the collar. And for the first time since the spar began, control shifted. The crowd gasped. A few laughed nervously, thinking it was a fluke, a desperate attempt that would fail. But the others, the more experienced ones, recognized the danger immediately. Their murmurs sharpened into shock. The master tried to pull back, but his balance was already compromised. He yanked at her legs, tried to posture up, but her grip only grew. Tighter, she squeezed every ounce of strength in her body, focused on this one move. Her silence screamed louder than any roar could have. For seconds passed. The master twisted, trying to free himself. He pressed his weight down, hoping to smother her out of position. But she shifted with him, adjusting her angle, tightening the choke further. Her legs locked like steel bars around his neck. 8 seconds passed. His calm expression began to change. His face tightened, his breathing hitched. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just a beginner's luck, it was real danger. He clawed at her grip, but her fingers stayed locked. His strength was immense, but her position was stronger. 10 seconds passed. The spectators erupted into shouts. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others leaned forward with wide eyes, whispering, "She's got him. She's actually got him." 12 seconds. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she refused to let go. Every ounce of ridicule, every laugh, every sneer she had endured was fueling her grip. She wasn't just holding the master, she was holding every doubt, every insult, every whispered "she doesn't belong." And she was choking it into silence. 14 seconds. The master tapped. His hand smacked the mat sharply, the universal signal of surrender. For a moment, the room froze. No one breathed. The sound of his tap echoed in their ears like a thunderclap. A black belt, respected, feared, untouchable, had just submitted to the woman they had mocked in front of everyone. In less than 15 seconds, and she had done it in silence. She loosened her grip and rolled back, releasing him immediately. Her chest heaved, sweat dripping from her brow, her body shaking with exhaustion. But her eyes were steady, unbroken, filled with a quiet fire. The master sat up slowly, rubbing his neck, disbelief in his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stared at her, as though trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, he gave a small nod, a nod of respect. The circle of students erupted. Some gasped, some clapped, some covered their mouths in shock. The same voices that had laughed now buzzed with awe. The ridicule that once filled the gym had been replaced with silence. And then, slowly, with cheers, she didn't smile. She didn't shout. She didn't throw her arms up in triumph. She simply bowed her head, humbly, as if she hadn't just shattered every expectation in that room. Her silence was her victory. Her discipline had spoken for her. It wasn't just a submission. It was a message to every person who had doubted her. To every whisper that said she didn't belong. To every laugh that tried to push her out, her answer had come, not in words, but in those 14 unforgettable seconds. She stood, adjusted her belt, and walked back to the edge of the mat. Her heart was still racing, her body trembling, but her spirit had never been calmer. For the first time since she stepped into that gym, she didn't feel like an outsider. She didn't feel like someone who didn't belong. She felt like a fighter. And, though the world outside the gym might never know the details of what happened that day, everyone in that room would carry the memory forever. They had witnessed the turning point, the moment when the underestimated woman silenced doubt and made history on a humble mat. The sound of the tap was still ringing in the air. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The room hung in silence, as if time itself had stopped to catch its breath. The black belt sat back on the mat, rubbing his neck with wide eyes, while she remained on her knees, head bowed, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. It was unreal. Everyone had expected her to lose quickly, to crumble in seconds under his weight and experience. Yet here she was, sweat-soaked, exhausted, trembling, but victorious. And not after a long, dragged-out battle. She had submitted him in just 14 seconds. The shock spread like a ripple through the crowd. Those who had laughed the loudest now stood frozen, mouths slightly open, eyes darting between her and the master. It was as if they couldn't quite believe what their own eyes had seen. Whispers broke the silence first. Did that really just happen? She caught him. She actually caught him. No way. That was a fluke. It had to be. But deep down, they knew it wasn't. They had seen the precision of her movement, the calm in her execution. It wasn't luck, it was skill. The master remained seated for a moment longer, his breathing steady, but his expression unsettled. For years, he had been the untouchable one, the mountain others tried to climb. And now, in front of his own students, a beginner someone ridiculed. Only weeks before had toppled him in a blink. Slowly, he stood. The room tensed. Would he be angry? Embarrassed? Would he dismiss her victory? Instead, he stepped forward, extended his hand, and bowed his head slightly. The gesture was simple, but in martial arts, it spoke louder than words. It was respect, genuine respect. The students stared, unable to ignore the message their master had just delivered. She was no longer to be mocked. She had earned her place. She accepted his hand with trembling fingers. When she rose, her knees wobbled, but she held her head high. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't bask in the victory. Her silence remained unbroken, but this time it carried a new weight. The same silence that had once shielded her from ridicule was now filled with power, with authority. Around the mat, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter was gone. The mockery had evaporated. In its place came applause, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the room filled with claps and cheers. It wasn't the sound of entertainment anymore. It was the sound of respect. She glanced briefly at the faces in the crowd. The same eyes that had once looked at her with doubt now glimmered with something else. Some showed admiration, others disbelief, and a few even carried guilt for the way they had mocked her. She didn't need apologies. The change in their gaze was enough. The shockwave extended beyond the mat. Students whispered to one another in the locker room afterward, their voices low but urgent. They replayed the match in their minds, analyzing how she had moved, how quickly she had seized the opportunity. It became the story of the night, the tale that would echo long after the mats had been rolled up. Even those who tried to downplay it couldn't hide their unease. He probably wasn't going full strength, one muttered. She just got lucky with timing. But his words rang hollow. Everyone had seen the moment his face changed, the way his body struggled against her grip. Luck didn't make a black belt tap. Only skill and courage did. For her, though, the victory wasn't just about proving herself to them. It was about proving herself to herself. As she sat later, tying her shoes in the corner, she felt a deep calm inside her. The same mat that had once felt like a battlefield of ridicule now felt like her home. The same people who had once laughed now treated her differently. She had walked into the gym as the outsider, the target of whispers. And in 14 seconds, she had rewritten her story. The instructor, who rarely showed emotion, approached her quietly as she packed her bag. "Good work," he said simply. His tone was clipped, professional, but she caught the faintest smile in his eyes. For him, that was as good as a standing ovation. Word spread quickly. The story of her submission traveled from mouth to mouth, growing with each retelling. The next week, students who hadn't been there were already asking, "Is it true? Did she really tap him?" Those who had witnessed it nodded, some still shaking their heads in disbelief. And so, the ridicule that once followed her had transformed into something else. She wasn't just the beginner anymore. She was the one who submitted the master. It became her identity in the gym, not as a joke, but as a badge of honor. Yet, she carried it humbly. She didn't boast, didn't remind people of what she had done. She returned to training as always quiet, focused, determined. But there was a new energy in the room. People who had once avoided partnering with her now stepped forward eagerly. Students who had mocked her now asked her questions, curious about how she had pulled it off. And every time, she answered the same way with calm silence, letting her actions speak during practice. The shockwave reached the master too. He trained harder after that, sharper, almost as though her victory had awakened something in him as well. But he never looked at her the same way again. Where there had once been a flicker of amusement, there was now respect in his eyes. For her, the match had lasted only 14 seconds, but the impact lasted far longer. Those who had doubted her now carried the memory of that day as proof that assumptions could be broken in an instant. It was no longer just her story. It was theirs too. They had seen how quickly ridicule could turn into reverence, how a single moment could silence a room, and how strength sometimes hides behind the quietest faces. The shockwave of her victory reshaped the gym forever. And though the whispers eventually faded, replaced by new challenges, new rivalries, and new students, that one moment lived on in the walls, in the mats, and in the memories of everyone who had been there. Because they hadn't just witnessed a sparring round, they had witnessed the birth of something greater, the undeniable power of resilience. The gym had returned to its usual rhythm. Mats rolled out, students warming up, the thud of bodies hitting the floor echoing like drums of discipline. But something had changed forever. There was a memory living in those walls now, a silent story that hung in the air every time the students bowed to step onto the mat. Her victory wasn't just a win. It had become a kind of legend. At first, it existed as whispers, retold in quiet corners. Did you hear? She tapped the master in 14 seconds. Then it grew louder. New students arrived and were told the tale before they even tied their belts. Some dismissed it at first, saying it was exaggerated, that surely the details had been twisted. But those who had been there shook their heads firmly. No, we saw it. We heard the tap. We'll never forget it. For her life did not suddenly become easy. She still trained every day, still bruised her arms and legs, still left class with sore muscles and aching lungs. But the stairs had shifted. Where once she had been met with ridicule, she was now met with curiosity, even admiration. When she walked into the gym, the room no longer quieted with mocking laughter, quieted with respect. The master himself was different with her too. He trained with her often, not as if she were beneath him, but as if she had earned the right to be tested. His corrections carried more detail, his guidance more attention. He had seen what she was capable of, and he knew her growth was only beginning. In his own way, he had become both her rival and her teacher, sharpening her further with every round. But the true legacy was not in the techniques she perfected or the titles she might chase later. It was in what her story represented. Her submission was not just a move on a mat. It was a moment that said, ridicule does not define you. Doubt does not decide your worth. Respect is earned in silence, and greatness can be born in an instant. Other women who walked into the gym after her looked at her differently. They no longer felt like outsiders. They saw her tying her belt quietly in the corner and thought, she can stand here, so can I. She had broken something invisible, the unspoken wall that had once told them they didn't belong. Even the men in the gym had learned something. They had seen arrogance humbled, strength overcome by patience and skill. They began to treat every new student with a little more caution, a little more respect. They had learned that underestimation was a dangerous game. And outside the gym, the story traveled to friends who had once questioned why she spent her evenings training listened wide-eyed as she described those 14 seconds. Strangers who heard the tale felt inspired by it, even if they had never set foot on a mat. Her story was no longer just about jiu-jitsu, it was about resilience, about standing tall when the world laughed at you, about proving that silence can roar louder than any insult. She didn't boast about it. She never had to. Her humility made the story even stronger. When asked about it, she would simply smile and say, "It was just training." But those who knew understood it was more than training. It was a transformation. Her legacy was not measured by medals or belts, but by the ripple she left behind. The ridicule that once tried to break her had become the fuel that built her. The laughter that once echoed against the walls had been replaced by applause. And the silence she carried had turned into a timeless reminder. You do not need to shout to be heard, you only need to endure. To act, to let your actions carve your story. Years later, when people spoke of her, they didn't always remember the exact technique she used or the details of the choke. What they remembered was the feeling, the shock, the disbelief, the sudden shift from ridicule to respect. They remembered the silence after the tap, the way the room held its breath, the way even the master bowed his head to her, and that was her true legacy. Not the submission itself, but the proof that anyone, no matter how underestimated, no matter how mocked, could rise, could stand, could seize their moment. That day in the gym, a black woman who had been ridiculed wrote her story not with words, but with action. In 14 seconds, she taught everyone present that greatness does not come from how others see you, it comes from how you see yourself, and how far you are willing to go when no one believes in you. The mat remembers. The walls remember. The people remember. And long after the sweat dried and the whispers faded, the legacy lived on, carried not just in that gym, but in the hearts of anyone who needed proof that resilience can turn ridicule into respect, and that silence can, in the right moment, become the loudest roar of all.